3 Disturbing True Stories from the Winter Season, Part 1. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're watching this right now, I'm going to assume you're already horizontal. Maybe you got the lights off, or at least dimmed to that soft amber glow that makes everything feel a little quieter. Maybe there's a blanket involved. Good, keep it there. Tonight, we're drifting into winter. Not the kind of winter that goes on greeting cards. Not the hot chocolate, cozy fireplace, soft snow falling outside the window kind of winter. I mean the other kind. The kind that has been quietly terrifying human beings for as long as human beings have been around to get terrified. The kind where the nights stretch out so long that you almost forget mornings are still a thing. The kind where small towns go quiet in ways that feel less like peace and more like something is simply waiting. We have 3 stories tonight. 3 true accounts from the winter season in America. And when I say true, I mean rooted in documented cases, historical records, and the kind of local reporting that tends to get buried after a while, because the communities involved would really rather move on. Each one comes from a different corner of this very large, very cold country, and each one, in its own quiet way, reminds us that winter has always had a particular talent for uncovering things that warmer seasons prefer to keep hidden. So settle in, get comfortable, close your eyes if you want. Honestly, you'll probably still follow along just fine. Let's begin. Our first story takes us to Alaska. Specifically, to a small community on the western coast of Alaska that most people in the lower 48 have genuinely never heard of and probably couldn't locate on a map without help. And that's not a criticism of anyone's geography knowledge. It's just that Alaska is enormous, genuinely, staggeringly enormous, in a way that doesn't fully register until you're looking at a map and realizing that if you placed it over the contiguous United States, it would stretch from the Atlantic nearly to the Pacific, and most of it is, for all practical purposes, empty. Not empty of life, not empty of beauty, but empty of the kinds of infrastructure that the rest of the country takes for granted. Roads, for instance, running water, hospitals within driving distance, cell service that works reliably in February. This particular community, we'll call it by the type of place it is, rather than its specific name, just to keep things smooth, was a village of somewhere between 200 and 400 people, depending on the season and who was counting. It sat near the coast, which sounds pleasant until you understand what a western Alaskan coastal winter actually looks like. Temperatures that fall so far below zero that the distinction between -20 and -30 starts to feel academic. Wind that comes off the Bering Sea with a kind of focused, personal hostility. And darkness. The particular, heavy, pressing darkness of a region where the sun barely clears the horizon in December and sometimes doesn't bother at all. The village had a small clinic. 1 room, essentially, with a radio and a supply of basic medications and a health aide who'd been trained to handle the things that could be handled and to call for help with the things that couldn't. The nearest actual hospital was accessible only by small plane, and small planes in western Alaska in winter are not always available because weather does not care about medical emergencies. In the winter of the early 2000s, the records on this are a little imprecise in terms of exact year, which is itself a detail worth sitting with. A family in this village began to exhibit symptoms that the health aide found difficult to categorize. It started, as these things often do, with something that looked like nothing much. Fatigue, a general heaviness. A few of the children in one extended family spending more time indoors than usual, which, to be fair, is not remarkable when it is -25 outside. But the health aide, a woman who had grown up in the village and had been doing this work for over a decade, noticed something that struck her as off. The symptoms were spreading in a pattern that didn't match flu, didn't match the respiratory infections that circulated every winter. The affected family members were tired in a specific way, confused occasionally. One of the older members of the family, a man in his 60s, was sleeping nearly 18 hours a day and couldn't always remember what he'd had for breakfast. The health aide radioed out. She described the symptoms carefully. She was told, essentially, to monitor and report back. And here is where the story takes a turn that is less dramatic than it is simply sad, and sad in a very quiet, slow, winter-specific way. The family in question lived in a home that had been built some years earlier, and that home had a heating system, a fuel oil furnace, as was common in the region, that had not been properly inspected or serviced in some time. Not because the family was negligent, not because they didn't care. But because getting someone qualified to inspect a heating system in a village accessible only by small plane requires a combination of scheduling, weather cooperation, and available funding that doesn't always come together in a smooth way. The furnace had developed a crack, and through that crack, carbon monoxide had been seeping into the living spaces of that home, slowly for weeks, possibly longer. Carbon monoxide is odorless, colorless, it doesn't announce itself. It simply accumulates, and the symptoms it produces, fatigue, confusion, headache, a heaviness that feels like depression or winter blues, or just being tired, are easy to attribute to other things, especially in a place where winter is long and hard, and those symptoms might reasonably be present for entirely unrelated reasons. By the time the connection was made, several family members required evacuation, the weather cooperated, barely, and a plane got in. Everyone survived, which is the part of this story that lets us exhale a little. But here is what lingers about it and why it belongs in a collection of winter horror. Not the dramatic jump scare kind, but the slow, creeping kind. The health aide described the experience of walking into that home and realizing what had been happening. She said it was like watching a family disappear in slow motion. Like winter had found a way inside the walls and was simply waiting them out. That image has stayed with me. Winter waiting them out. It's a patient thing, winter. It doesn't need to rush. Let's drift a little further into the cold before we move to our second story. There's something specific about the way small Alaskan communities experience winter that is worth understanding, because it contextualizes not just this story but a whole pattern of stories that come out of these places. The isolation isn't metaphorical. It isn't the kind of isolation you feel in a suburb when you haven't talked to your neighbors in a while. It is structural, physical, logistical isolation. Many of these villages have no road connection to anywhere else. The only way in or out is by plane or, in some cases and some seasons, by boat. In winter, the boat option disappears, and the plane option becomes contingent on weather that is reliably uncooperative. This means that when something goes wrong, medically, structurally, socially, the response time is not measured in minutes or hours the way it might be in a city. It can be measured in days, sometimes longer. It also means that communities develop an extraordinary degree of self-reliance. Knowledge gets passed down. People learn to handle things that would elsewhere be immediately handed off to a specialist. And there is genuine beauty in that. There is resilience and competence and a kind of community cohesion that is rare. But there is also sometimes a quiet accumulation of problems that don't get addressed because addressing them requires resources and access that simply aren't available. And winter, in its patience, has a way of turning small, unaddressed problems into large ones. This is the context in which our second story lives. Part 2, The House at the End of the Road. Our second story takes us away from Alaska and down into the continental United States, to a part of the country that also knows winter well, but in a different register. We're going to the rural Midwest, specifically to a small town in Minnesota. And I want to be careful here about specificity because this story involves a family, and families, even in documented cases, deserve a certain amount of distance. But the broad outlines are a matter of public record and have been discussed in various forms over the years. Minnesota winters are not, to put it gently, forgiving. The state has a certain cultural relationship with cold that involves a degree of stoic acceptance bordering on the philosophical. When the temperature drops to -30 and someone from Minnesota says, "Oh, it's a bit brisk," they are not being sarcastic. They have simply made their peace with the situation. But even by Minnesota standards, the winter of the year in question was severe. Record snowfall in parts of the state, roads closed for extended periods. The kind of winter where rural areas, which are always a little cut off, become significantly more so. The family at the center of this story lived in a farmhouse about 12 miles outside of a small town. 12 miles is not, in normal circumstances, very far. In a Minnesota winter with closed roads and a driveway buried under several feet of snow, 12 miles can be effectively infinite. The family had been there for generations. This is relevant, and it connects to something we'll return to. Multiple generations of the same family on the same land, which is not unusual in rural agricultural communities, where land is passed down and families stay rooted. There's a stability to that, a sense of continuity. There's also sometimes a degree of insularity that develops, not hostility, just self-containment, an inward orientation that comes from years of handling things within the family unit, of not reaching out, of managing. The family came to the attention of county social services in the early part of one particularly brutal winter, when a school bus driver reported that 2 of the children who normally boarded his bus had been absent for several weeks. This wasn't immediately alarming. Absences in rural areas during bad winters happen. Roads are impassable. Families keep kids home. But the duration eventually triggered a check-in call, which went to voicemail, which triggered another call, which also went to voicemail, which eventually triggered a welfare check. Getting a deputy out to that farmhouse in those conditions took time. The roads had to be at least partially passable. Weather had to cooperate enough. When the deputy finally made it out, what he found was a family that was, in the most technical sense, fine. Everyone was alive. The house was heated. There was food. The children were present and appeared physically healthy. But the deputy's report, and this is the part that gets into territory that is quietly unsettling rather than dramatically horrifying, described a household that had been functionally closed to the outside world for what appeared to be a very long time. Not just that winter. For a long time, the children, when the deputy spoke to them, were polite, cooperative. But their knowledge of the outside world was limited in ways that were difficult to immediately quantify. They didn't know certain things that children their age typically know. They hadn't been to school regularly enough to have the reference points that come from that. What emerged over weeks of subsequent investigation by social services was a picture of a family that had, over several generations, gradually reduced its contact with the outside world to near zero. Not as a deliberate ideological choice, not as any kind of religious movement, but simply through a slow accretion of choices and circumstances. A grandparent who distrusted institutions. Parents who had grown up with that distrust and deepened it. A self-sufficiency that had curdled gradually into something more like withdrawal. And winter, every winter, had reinforced it. Because winter made staying in easy. Winter made the outside world feel remote and inaccessible. Winter provided a kind of external justification for what was, underneath, a pattern that had been building for decades. The children were ultimately enrolled in school. Services were provided. The story doesn't end in tragedy, which is again the part that allows us to breathe. But what stays with me about this story, and why I think it belongs in a collection of winter accounts specifically, is that winter didn't cause what happened to that family. It just enabled it, amplified it, gave it cover, season after season, year after year. Winter as an accomplice, quiet, patient, reliable. There's something about that framing that I find more unsettling than any dramatic event. The idea that cold and darkness and isolation can work together over a long period of time to gradually narrow a life, a family, a world, without anyone necessarily noticing until someone goes looking. Let's rest here for a moment before we move on. I want to talk briefly about the broader pattern of what researchers and social workers who operate in rural areas sometimes call hidden households. This is not a sensational term. It's a clinical one, and it describes a phenomenon that is documented across rural America. Families or individuals who, for various reasons, have reduced their contact with institutions, services, and the broader community to such a degree that they effectively become invisible to the systems designed to monitor well-being. This happens for many reasons. Distrust of government, which has deep and sometimes entirely legitimate historical roots in certain communities. Geographic isolation that makes contact with services genuinely difficult. Mental health, challenges within families that go unaddressed for lack of access to care. Economic circumstances that lead to a kind of defensive withdrawal. Generational patterns that perpetuate themselves without anyone consciously choosing them. And winter is consistently identified in the literature on this subject as a factor, not the only factor, not even the primary one, but a consistent amplifier. Because winter closes roads, and closed roads mean fewer welfare checks, fewer school bus routes, fewer informal community contacts. Because winter raises heating costs and food costs and puts additional stress on already stressed households. Because winter makes it harder to get out, and when it's harder to get out, whatever is happening inside a house tends to intensify. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it's worth sitting with in a quiet, late-night kind of way. The idea that the season we most associate with warmth and family and gathering, and winter genuinely does carry those associations, is also, for some households, the season that seals them in. All right, let's drift to our third story. Part 3. The town that stopped asking questions. This one takes us to a different kind of winter. Not the sharp, dry, brutal cold of Minnesota or Alaska, but the gray, wet, relentless cold of the rural Appalachian region. Specifically, a small town in West Virginia, though the story has echoes in similar communities across Kentucky, Tennessee, and the parts of Virginia that the state's promotional materials don't spend a lot of time on. Appalachian winter is not as cinematically cold as the northern variety, but it has its own particular character. The gray skies that settle in around November and don't fully lift until March or April. The damp that gets into everything. The mountains that block light and create valleys where winter light barely penetrates even at midday. It's a softer cold in terms of temperature, but it has a psychological weight that people who've lived there describe in consistent terms. It presses down. It flattens. The town in this story was small even by small town standards. A few hundred people, maybe 1,000 at the county seat a few miles away. The economy had been through the particular arc that many Appalachian communities know well. Coal, then less coal, then the long, difficult period after the coal, when the economic infrastructure that had built up around a single industry quietly collapsed, and the question of what comes next remained stubbornly unanswered. Communities in this situation develop particular social dynamics. There's a closeness that comes from shared hardship, a genuine sense of mutual support and community identity, and there's also, sometimes, a circling of the wagons. A tendency to handle things internally, a resistance to outside involvement that is, again, not unreasonable given the historical relationship between these communities and the outside institutions that have interacted with them. The story begins, as several of our stories begin, with children. Specifically, with a school nurse at the small elementary school who noticed, over the course of a single winter, an unusual pattern in the children she was seeing. The school nurse, let's call her by her professional title rather than her name, had been at the school for several years and knew most of the families. She knew which kids had chronic conditions, which families struggled, which ones were doing well. She had the institutional knowledge that comes from being embedded in a small community for long enough to understand its textures. What she noticed that winter was a cluster of children from several related families, because in a town that small, many families are related, presenting with developmental concerns that she hadn't seen before, or rather that she had seen before in individual cases, but never in this density, in this pattern. The children were physically healthy, mostly, but there were indicators that something was affecting their development, learning difficulties of a specific and somewhat unusual kind. Physical characteristics that, when she eventually consulted with a specialist, pointed in a direction she hadn't initially considered. It took months. It took the school nurse filing reports that went initially nowhere, then somewhere, then required the involvement of a state health official, which required a particular kind of diplomatic navigation because the community was, understandably, not enthusiastic about outside scrutiny. What the investigation eventually uncovered was a pattern of consanguinity. That's the clinical term for intermarriage or reproduction between closely related individuals that had been ongoing in a subset of the community for several generations. Not as a deliberate practice, not as anything anyone was consciously choosing, but as a consequence of the same dynamics we've been discussing all night. Isolation, insularity, reduced contact with the outside world, a community that had, over time, become small in ways that weren't just geographic. Now, and I want to be careful here because this is genuinely sensitive, this is not a story about villainy. It's not a story about anyone deliberately doing harm. It's a story about how geographic and economic isolation, sustained over generations, can produce outcomes that no one intended, and that the affected community is, in many ways, the victim of rather than the author of. The genetic consequences of sustained consanguinity are well documented in medical literature. Recessive conditions become more likely to express. Certain developmental conditions appear at higher rates. The children bearing these consequences did not choose them, and neither, in any meaningful sense, did their parents or grandparents. What the story is really about, and why winter belongs in it, is invisibility. It happened in winter because winter is when these communities seal themselves off most completely. The investigation that eventually unraveled it began with a school nurse noticing something in the gray winter months, when everyone else had essentially stopped looking. When the roads were difficult, and the state health office was focused on flu season and the national news was preoccupied with other things. Winter didn't cause this. Decades of neglect and isolation caused this. But winter was the season in which it became invisible, over and over again, until finally someone noticed. Part 4. What darkness carries? I want to step back for a moment, gently, the way you step back from something without wanting to look away entirely, and think about what these 3 stories have in common. They're not ghost stories. They don't involve anything supernatural. There are no monsters, not in the traditional sense. No dramatic moments of horror. No sudden revelations that I've been building toward. That's intentional. This is a show about the slow kind of disturbing, the kind that settles in gradually, the way cold does, the way darkness does. What all 3 of these stories share is something simple and a little bit haunting. Winter as an enabler. Winter as the season that makes invisible things more invisible. That reinforces isolation, amplifies whatever is already present inside a closed space, and reduces the likelihood that anyone from outside will look. This is a pattern that shows up consistently in studies of rural America, in social services data, in public health research, and in the accounts of people who do welfare and outreach work in isolated communities. Winter consistently correlates with delayed identification of problems, with longer periods between last contact and first concern, with outcomes that might have been different if the season had been different. And there's something about that which I think is worth holding lightly as you drift towards sleep tonight. Not in a distressing way, just as a kind of gentle awareness. The people in our stories tonight were not extraordinary in their suffering. They were ordinary people in ordinary communities dealing with the ordinary consequences of isolation, poverty, limited access to services, and the particular American tendency to leave rural communities to manage on their own until something goes wrong that can't be ignored. Winter just turned up the dial on all of that, quietly, patiently. Winter is very good at patience. Let's return for a little while to the Alaskan village. There's more to that story, and I find myself drawn back to it. After the carbon monoxide incident, and the word incident feels inadequate, but it's what the records use, the community underwent a period of reflection that is itself interesting and quietly moving. The village council met. The health aide wrote a detailed account of everything she had noticed, everything she had reported, every moment at which the situation might have been caught earlier. Not as a document of blame, as a document of learning. What she described in that account was a kind of collective blindness that she thought was worth naming, honestly. Not blindness to suffering. The community was deeply attentive to its members, as isolated communities often are, in ways that larger communities frequently fail to be. But blindness to a particular category of danger. The kind that doesn't look like danger, the kind that looks like tiredness, or winter, or getting older, or just the general weight of living somewhere difficult. She wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here because her words deserve not to be reproduced directly, that the hardest part was not the emergency. The hardest part was the weeks before the emergency, when everything was quietly wrong and everyone who noticed anything chalked it up to winter. Chalked it up to winter. I keep coming back to that phrase. The idea that winter is such a reliable explanation for human diminishment, for tiredness, for heaviness, for withdrawal, for all the ways people become less of themselves in the dark months, that it can serve as cover for things that are genuinely wrong. A diagnostic confusion built into the season itself. The health aide's account was eventually shared, with permission, in a regional public health publication that circulates among people doing rural and remote healthcare work in Alaska. It was not widely read. It is the kind of document that has impact on the small number of people who find it, and exists otherwise in the quiet archive of things that mattered to the people involved and to almost no one else, which is its own kind of winter in a way. Good work done quietly, in the dark, with limited audience, the seasonal work of keeping small communities alive and attended to, carried out by people whose names most of us will never know. Let's drift back to Minnesota for a moment. The family in the farmhouse had a particular detail in their story that I've been holding back because it fits better here in the slower middle section of the night than it did earlier. After the children were enrolled in school and services were established and the immediate concerns were addressed, a social worker made several visits to the family over the following months. The grandmother, the matriarch of the family, the one whose distrust of institutions had set the whole pattern in motion decades earlier, agreed to meet with her on one occasion. Just once. The social worker later described the conversation in her case notes in a way that has been quoted in a few discussions of rural isolation. The grandmother was, by all accounts, a sharp and competent woman, intelligent, self-possessed. She had built something, a functioning household, a degree of self-sufficiency, a way of surviving in a hard place, and she knew it. What she said to the social worker, the part that gets quoted, was something to the effect of, "Every winter, I told myself we'd go back out in the spring. And then spring would come, and it was easier to stay in, so we'd stay in one more year. And then winter would come again, one more year, and then winter would come again." There's a rhythm to that I find almost hypnotic. The way each winter reinforces the last one. The way the decision to withdraw gets made again and again, not as a grand commitment, but as a small seasonal repetition. Just one more winter, just until spring. And then spring comes and the going out doesn't happen, and then winter comes again. It's a pattern that psychologists who work with isolated individuals recognize. The seasonality of social withdrawal, the way winter provides both opportunity and justification for the pulling in that some people and some families are already inclined toward. And the way that, repeated enough times, what started as a response to difficult circumstances becomes the circumstances themselves. Part 5. Long winters and longer silences. We're getting deeper into the night now. Let's slow down even further. I want to talk about something that runs underneath all three of our stories tonight. Something that doesn't get named explicitly in any of the reports or case files or accounts we've been drawing on, but that seems important in a quiet way. All three of these stories involve communities that were, in various ways, failed by distance. Not abandoned. That word implies a dramatic act of withdrawal, just left at a distance that made ordinary support and oversight difficult. Communities that were not, in the language of policy, underserved in a way that generated urgent intervention, but that had needs that were not being met, and that winter reliably every year made harder to meet. This is a feature of American geography that is easy to forget if you live in a city or a suburb or anywhere with reliable road access and nearby medical facilities. A very significant portion of this country's population lives in conditions where basic services are genuinely difficult to access, where the nearest emergency room is an hour away, where the school nurse is part-time or the school itself is consolidated from 3 small towns into one because there weren't enough kids to staff 3 buildings, where the county has 1 social worker covering a territory that would take 2 hours to drive across in good conditions. And in these places, winter is not a season, it's a condition. A persistent recurring condition that amplifies everything else. The carbon monoxide in the Alaskan village, the generational withdrawal in the Minnesota farmhouse, the invisible health patterns in the Appalachian town. None of these things were caused by winter. All of them were made harder to see, harder to address, harder to interrupt by winter. There's a researcher, I won't name her because I haven't confirmed she'd want to be named in this context, who has spent a career studying what she calls seasonal service gaps in rural American communities. Her work is methodical and not particularly dramatic. She tracks things like welfare check response times, school attendance reporting lag times, and the correlation between these metrics and calendar season. The data is, in her words, consistent and concerning. Response times go up in winter. Reporting lags go up in winter. The gap between the onset of a problem and its identification by anyone outside the household goes up, consistently, measurably, in winter. She's not describing malice. She's not describing negligence in the sense of anyone failing to do their job. She's describing a structural reality. Rural roads are harder to drive in winter. Rural emergency services have fewer resources in winter because flu and cold weather injuries strain them. Rural schools have more absences in winter that are entirely normal and make abnormal absences harder to distinguish. Rural social services, which are already operating on thin margins, don't expand to account for winter conditions because there's no budget to expand with. The season does work that no one consciously assigns to it, and the work it does consistently is to make the invisible more invisible and to make the help slower to arrive. Let's return to the Appalachian town one more time before we start winding down. The school nurse's report, which began the investigation, was filed in January. The investigation was initiated in March. The first specialist consultation happened in May. The findings were not officially documented until the following autumn. That timeline, January to autumn, is its own kind of story, and it's worth noting that January is when the nurse noticed something, which means she was paying attention in winter. In gray, flat, pressing Appalachian winter, she was paying attention and she saw something and she reported it. There's a version of the story that focuses on what went wrong, on the slow response, the the difficult navigation, the years and generations before anyone noticed. That version is true, and it matters. But there's another version that starts with a school nurse in January who noticed something quiet and wrong in a cluster of children and didn't chalk it up to winter. I think about that a lot. The decision not to chalk something up to winter, the decision to look a little more carefully at the fatigue, the confusion, the developmental patterns, the absence from the school bus, to say this is not just winter. Something else is here. In all three of our stories, the person who eventually saw clearly was someone who had decided, for whatever reason, to keep looking. A health aide who kept filing reports. A school bus driver who kept noticing. A school nurse in January. None of them are famous. None of them are in any history you'd find in a textbook. They did quiet work in difficult conditions, and they kept their eyes open when it would have been entirely reasonable to close them. There's something I find genuinely comforting in that. Not in the problems themselves, but in the people who noticed them. Part 6. The last long night. We're near the end of our evening together. The three stories revisited tonight, the Alaskan village and the invisible poison in the walls, the Minnesota farmhouse and the family that kept staying in just one more winter, the Appalachian town and the generations of invisible consequence. They all end, to varying degrees, in some kind of recognition. Someone saw. Someone reported. Help arrived, imperfectly and slowly, but it arrived. Not every story like these ends that way. That's worth saying plainly, without drama. The documented cases we know about are, by definition, the ones that were eventually documented. The ones that remained invisible remain invisible. The household where no school bus driver noticed, where no health aide kept filing, where no school nurse was paying attention in January. Those are the stories we don't know, and that's not a horror observation, not in the dramatic sense. It's just a quiet, factual one. The darkness hides what the light doesn't reach. I want to close tonight with a small thing. In the account written by the Alaskan health aide, the one that was published quietly in a regional health journal and read by a small number of people, she ends with a passage that I've been carrying around since I first encountered it. She describes standing outside the village on a clear January night after the family had been evacuated and treated and the situation had resolved. She describes the darkness, the particular deep, textured darkness of rural Alaska in midwinter, which is not the darkness of a city at night with its ambient glow, but a genuine, complete, enveloping dark that has no bottom to it. And she describes not being afraid of it. She says something to the effect of, "The dark is just the dark. It doesn't do anything to you that isn't already in the situation. It just takes away the light that was hiding it." I think about that observation more than I probably should. The dark takes away the light that was hiding it. Winter doesn't create the problems. It removes the light that was hiding them. The isolation, the inadequate services, the generational patterns, the structural neglect, all of that is present in summer too. Winter just turns the light down, makes it harder to see, harder to reach, harder to help, which means, in a strange and gentle way, that winter is honest, more honest than we might want. It shows us what we were looking away from in the easier seasons. 3 stories, a small Alaskan village, a Minnesota farmhouse 12 miles from a town, a gray Appalachian community in January. 3 versions of the same quiet truth about winter and isolation and the patience required to keep watching when the season is doing its best to make watching difficult. None of these stories are comfortable. But none of them are hopeless either. A health aide who kept filing reports, a school bus driver who kept noticing, a school nurse in January who decided something was wrong and said so. That's not heroism in the grand sense. It's just attention. Sustained, quiet, winter-resistant attention. It's enough to fall asleep to, I think. All right, everyone, that's our night. If you're still with me, if you haven't drifted off somewhere in the middle of a Minnesota winter or an Alaskan January, thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. I mean that in the least ominous way possible. Pull the blanket up. Let the night do its thing. Winter is patient, as we've established, but so is sleep. Take good care of yourselves. Look out for the people around you, even in the easy seasons, especially in the easy seasons maybe. And I'll see you next time, whenever that is, wherever we end up drifting. Good night.